Thanks so much, Gab. I think the overwhelming thing for me when I started AviaDev was really that we wanted this to be an optimistic and positive conference. And, we're going in the right direction, and that's the key. So, great. Thanks for all the work, and obviously it was great timing that it's just after the IATA AGM. So I hope you're all tweeting, and we want to see this Twitter wall full of your pictures and your experiences and the people that you're going to meet. All the presentations will be available post-event, so don't worry about that. We will make sure you all get a copy. Moving on to the next session. This particular session is very special for me, as the person I will be interviewing was actually identified by the AviaDev Advisory Board as our #1 target for this particular session. Low-cost air travel is a reality on every other continent in the world, but it's proved really elusive in Africa. And we'll be talking about this. We've got a panel about this later, about the challenges with low-cost airlines. In 2012, a potentially game-changing airline came to the market. I say potentially game-changing because of who its architects were. The architects were some of the very same people that overseen the birth and astronomical rise of EasyJet in Europe. However, as is often the story in Africa, the airline encountered some strong headwinds. It struggled to make its investors a return. And in a radical move, one of the largest shareholders, Stelios from EasyJet, decided enough was enough. He removed the CEO and most of the executive committee. It was a purge almost. That was over 2 years ago. The new man appointed took office in August 2016, was someone with vast experience in the African market, and more importantly, the low-cost airline market in Africa. Nico Bezuidenhout and I've said it wrong, I know, I'll just say Nico from now, held the position of CEO at Mango for 10 years, and on 2 occasions operated as acting CEO of South African Airways as well. His appointment, along with that of other members of the senior management team, including Sylvain, who's sat over here, who you'll hear from later, has delivered a transformation in the business model of fastjet and its fortunes as well, as Gad alluded to in his slides. So, please join me in welcoming Nico on stage.
Thank you, John.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, welcome to AviaDev.
Thank you. Thank you.
So how have you found the last couple of years? How did it compare to your previous life?
Look, it's quite interesting. I think that learned a lot, having to operate in multiple jurisdictions in Africa now. A lot of changes in the business, the different exposures in terms of different shareholders. Having operated in both private and public enterprise, I think that fastjet has been a tremendous challenge, but a tremendous and exciting opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, as we alluded to before, fastjet really started as a low-cost carrier for Africa, but it made quite a lot of mistakes when it tried to implement the European low-cost model into Africa with even a headquarters in Gatwick. And I'm one of these people who suffered. I'm a shareholder in fastjet, I'll admit that. It's a UK PLC, so I can buy shares. And that it wasn't the best investment that I've ever made. Luckily, I didn't bet the house on it, so don't worry, I won't be knocking on your door asking for a spare room. But they've obviously been very well documented. But how would you describe the business model of fastjet now?
Well, I think, firstly, my apologies for your shareholding.
Thank you. You can write me a check if you want, that's fine.
We're hopefully sorting it out. Look, I think that the basic principle, underlying principle of affordable air travel in Africa is a no-brainer. Our continent is a vast continent. We've got 20% of the world's population, or 15% of the land mass, or vice versa. And it's with less than 3% of global aviation sitting in Africa, it's clear that there's a disconnect. And that disconnect links back to the regulatory framework. It links back to the cost of service provisioning, aviation service provisioning in Africa. So I think that we saw in the South African market in the early 2000s how we had rapid economic growth, rapid aviation growth as carriers like Kalula, like One Time, like Mango, stimulated demand. So it's clear that the opportunity exists. In the case of the fastjet experience, though, it was straightforward, just the wrong tool for the wrong job in terms of aircraft type. And regardless of which business model you operate, if you do not adapt it for local nuances, you are bound to fail. Africa is a continent of 54 countries, 2,000 languages, 1.2 billion people. The biggest mistake you can make is act as if it's one homogeneous place, because it is not. You have to respect the local nuances and the differences. Even in South Africa, Cape Town is a very different place to Johannesburg, and if you do not cater for the consumer demands and the consumer preferences with the right product and right service offering, you are bound to fail, and that's what's happened in the case of fastjet historically.
And is there a way of pigeonholing the actual, what would you call fastjet as a carrier? Because there's so many variants now. It was very simple. Now you've got ultra low-cost carriers and hybrid carriers, so is that important? But if you did, how would you sort of explain?
Look, I think that ultimately the whole preoccupation of trying to define a carrier as a low-cost carrier, as a full-service carrier, in my opinion, humble opinion, is misplaced. At the end of the day, whether you're a full-service carrier, a traditional full-service carrier, or whether you fly a kite, you need to do so cost-efficiently and effectively. So there's nothing wrong with a full-service carrier embarking on high aircraft utilization, high people productivity. In the case of fastjet, all we've really done is we've changed the gauge size. So essentially, the easiest way to understand it is that we're a regional feeder carrier with a cost advantage that focuses on aircraft utilization, people productivity, and the like.
Yeah, got you. And what about the other big challenge, of course, is market access? And we talked about, sorry, Gad, SATAM. We've talked about it. And as a sort of private airline, how difficult has market access been, and is that improving?
I think that's been one of my biggest challenges and frustrations and potentially disappointments in terms of joining fastjet. The African airspace, there needs to be much more conviction well beyond the single air transportation market, YD. There needs to be actions, there needs to be words. We need to get to a greater level of standardization at civil aviation authority level. So I'm finding big gaps, one country to another, in terms of the caliber of civil aviation authority, for example, and the extent to which these structures engage in protectionist behavior. At the end of the day, we're trying to create a symbiotic relationship. We're trying to provide cost-effective air transportation, regardless of ownership structure, regardless of brand name. And I think that Africa has got some way to go in terms of just get the chip off the shoulder, stop the protectionist behavior. If we don't increase productivity, efficiency, and cost of air travel, you will not see faster economic growth. Africa as a region is projected to be the second fastest growing economic region globally. That can only happen if we have aviation growth beyond the 5% level that we're seeing at present.
Yeah, 100%. So leading on from that, I think it's important to talk about what you've done in Mozambique, because I know Sandra's here from Mozambique Civil Aviation, and Mozambique Airport, should I say, and obviously the partnership that you've struck up with LAM is really interesting because, again, you've collaborated rather than competed. So can you tell us a little bit more for the guys that don't sort of know the background to that and why you did it?
Well, since the Moz CAA is here, I must state, I think the Moz CAA is very good. As far as our partnership with LAM is concerned, the one reality is that I think that African states or countries around the world take pride in having flag carriers. And you have to reconcile yourself to the fact that going up against flag carriers is a risky business, and you need to do so intelligently or smartly. So if we can have a win-win situation where LAM, as proudly as a flag carrier to Mozambique, has its place and we can collaborate, the earlier term used by Gad, and help each other where we may be more efficient than LAM, or in other cases, LAM may be more efficient than us. And we can complement each other's route networks to the extent legally permissible. This is not necessary, this is not collusion in nature. This is a question of, as a country, Mozambique has got, as all other countries, limited available resources. And best we spread these resources to ensure maximum connectivity, more destinations, and less overlap of service, because ultimately overlap of service is waste.
Yeah. And is there other countries that are ripe for this kind of partnership? And is there anybody that you can tell us you're talking to or that you would be interested? Obviously, fastjet in its first form did have something going on in West Africa, which didn't work. But, you know, are there other countries that you're talking to about a similar sort of setup? Because it's working in Mozambique.
I think that, look, without being too overly critical of the original ambitions and plans for fastjet, when you take into account that it is 54 independent states, 54 AOCs that you ultimately would end up getting, I think the ambition to be a Pan-African carrier is quite grandiose if you have got a single cookie-cutter type of approach, i.e. we have to own all the AOCs, we have to operate everything. Fastjet has, in a sense, departed from that standpoint. So yes, there are certain AOCs that we want to control, we want to have more of an equity stake in, and we are willing to take more of a commercial risk on. Then there are other countries where a collaboration, brand licensing, brand franchising is potentially more of an appropriate approach. So for fastjet, we're focusing on cementing our position in Tanzania and in Zimbabwe and Mozambique, looking at the Southern African market space, whereafter we'll be looking at West Africa. And it will in each case be on a country-by-country basis, be depending on what's the nature of that country, what's the market opportunity, and what is the, dare I say, level of maturity of the flag carrier in that country in terms of whether or not do they embrace it. Does the term collaboration feature in their dialect?
Yeah, and surely we hear a lot of talk around Africa about we're going to have a national carrier, we're going to restart it, and it's often very much driven by the political environment. But of course, if you have a country that doesn't have that national carrier, in the back of your mind always is, what if suddenly they change the mind, they launch that, and then at the detriment to you? So that has to be, there has to be this element of trust, I guess. Yeah. And of course, the politicians can change too. And once bitten, you know, you don't want to have that experience again.
Look, the political, economic, and social risk profile of each country greatly informs whether or not we'd be looking at that country. There's a common misconception. I think if we sit around this room, we can all acknowledge that in the value chain of aviation, airlines unfortunately sit last in that pecking order of profitability. The unfortunate thing is that a lot of African governments have a misconception. They think airlines are hugely profitable, that it's this sexy industry that they have to own it. So I think it is a point of ongoing dialogue and discussion and relationship building with each country, each government that we engage in.
So let's move on to distribution, ticket distribution. There's a really interesting thing going on that I was lucky enough to see Sylvan's presentation a couple of months ago that you're doing in Mozambique with the ticket distribution. I know you're now selling tickets at checkout counters at supermarkets in South Africa, and there's this talk of, it's obviously because of the profile split of the traveler. So can you give us a bit more information on that for the uninitiated?
Yeah. Look, I think that my life in aviation started in the distribution space, and originally I was accountable for direct distribution in the case of South African Airways, and in that instance, early in the 2000s, maybe travel agents were potentially more of an enemy of mine than a friend. Over the years, I think maybe I've grown up a bit and realized that the traditional distribution mechanisms have got a very important role to play, and they'll continue to play that role. In the last couple of months, we've, as fastjet, made ourselves available for GDS distribution on both Travelport and Amadeus. And that caters for a very specific market segment, typically your corporate traveler and your higher-end leisure traveler. Going back more than 10 years now, we started in the case of Mango distribution through ShopRite Checkers, for example. And the logic there is just that today, a lot of the unflown market currently travel on long-haul intercity bus ticketing. Those tickets are typically distributed through general retailers. So if I'm looking to get a transmodal switch from bus transportation into air transportation for that market segment, it is best to go fetch that market segment in the shop where they buy currently. Additionally, in a previous life of mine, I was involved in soccer ticketing and distribution, and what I realized there is that if you ask the consumer, the price-sensitive consumer, to spend another 10, 20 Rand or $5 for public transportation to go and purchase the ticket, that is part of the cost of the overall journey. So to the extent that you can take ticket distribution into the hands of consumers, into the communities, into environments where they used to shop, you save cost, plus there's a natural trust factor. In the case of, for example, say, ShopRite Checkers, half the population probably bought their kids' first purity from ShopRite Checkers. So if you trust this brand to buy your food from, potentially you'll trust this brand to buy your airline tickets from. So it's all about convenience, accessibility, affordability. There's no point in making your cheapest tickets available on the internet when only 10% of the population has access to the internet.
Yeah, so it's listening to the community and finding the right place. So one of the challenges that all the airlines have is, especially in Africa, it's a big problem, is late booking. People book their flights late. So do you see that changing? Can we change buyer behavior, or are we stuck with that and we have to kind of work with it in the ways that you're sort of talking about?
I think that the overall market has become far too fragmented to ever see us reverse that trend. When I first joined aviation, I think the average advance purchase was maybe 30 days. By the time that I got to fastjet, it's 3 days. So I don't think that that trend is going to be reversed, unfortunately, and it wreaks havoc in your pricing, revenue management environments. And it requires you to have quite a nerve, because you need to hold out until that last minute.
Yeah, and that's a challenge, as we know, for everybody. And thinking about innovations and listening to your customers, one of my favorite fastjet innovations is the freighty fare that you have, which obviously is to compete with the bus. And you can also, there's a route where I believe you can pre-book a bucket of fish to transport within Tanzania. So the thinking behind this, did this come from just doing market research? Like, how did you actually work out that was what you needed to do?
Yeah. Look, I'd venture a guess to say that in that case it was probably a lucky guess. The one big mistake that fastjet made historically is removing its management from the local market, so that you can pick up those nuances. In the coming months, we're doing a lot of work in terms of just getting the systems and the basic foundations right in the business. In the next 60 days or so, we'll migrate to the newest version of the Radix platform. We'll be the first carrier in Africa to be on that platform. We'll be introducing additional fare family type of products in the market. On a product side, we'll be introducing not quite innovation, but additional routes in our Tanzania network, where we're introducing 3 additional turboprop aircraft specifically for the route network there. So for the next 6 months, it's maybe not as exciting. It's all about stabilizing and cementing and bedding down the changes. This business has been through a tremendous amount of changes over the last 18 months. Changing a fleet is pulling at the core of the business. You affect every process. We've gone through a full fleet change. And I may as well also, just for the record, state that us moving across, for the first 10 years of my aviation career, I was pretty much all Boeing. Fastjet was all Airbus. We now operate some Embraers. There's nothing wrong with the A319 in the African context. It's just too big a tool for Tanzania, for that market segment. For South Africa, given the thicker routes, it's a great product and a great tool.
Yeah, I think the learning for me within Africa is that the opportunity, as Gad alluded to, is intra-African. And if you can fly more frequencies that are shorter lengths, then you can make more money and give the consumer what they want, which is the convenience to fly into a city in the morning, have a meeting, and come back that evening. It makes a lot of sense, and I think too often people aim too far, and we've ignored that intra-African opportunity for too long. And I do think that this leads us really to my final question, which is, how do you see African aviation in 10 years? Not what do the numbers say, but how do you see it? How established will these new carriers be? What will we be looking at?
So I think that Peter Drucker coined the phrase of a value economy back in '89, I think it was. Looking forward in 10 years, I think the notions of a value economy is going to be more true than ever in Africa. We're dealing with smarter consumers who demand more value for money. and they will demand cost efficiency from the service providers. Of course, safety is a given and hence not discussed. As a consequence, the airlines that are efficient, that are effective, will survive. It won't be the 200-odd airlines that exist on the African continent today. There's no doubt that there'll be a level of consolidation. Aviation remains a scale business. If you do not have scale, you're unlikely to survive. So I do see fewer airlines around in 10 years from now. Better run airlines, more efficient, delivering value for money to the African consumer. And it's not, what I'm expressing is not a wish, it's an outright necessity. Without that, you won't get growth in sustainable and affordable air transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for your time, Nico. It's been wonderful chatting to you. And
thank you, John.
Thanks, everybody, for your attention. So if you give Nico a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks. Appreciate it.